and welcome everyone. I've been listening to some of the previous sessions across this 24-hour webathon, and I am honestly honored to be a part of this effort, to be alongside so many amazing climate leaders in the space, contributing their time and their efforts to help the ongoing situation in Ukraine. A few thoughts from myself before I begin the session. I mean, the impetus for us all gathering here today, the impetus for you all in the audience listening in and engaging and raising funds is so incredibly important, clearly. The ongoing war in the Ukraine is continuing to send shockwaves across the world every day, all while real people are experiencing their lives torn apart. And for that, I want to send my sincerest thoughts to you all impacted by this war in any way, especially the individuals in Ukraine, and to thank those who have donated and to our amazing hosts for putting us all together. I mean, in addition to the human toll this war is taking, the impact on sustainability is quite clear, and we are hearing it throughout these 24 hours. The transport industry specifically, what we're going to be talking about for the next hour, is not unique in that sense either. Especially even before the situation in Ukraine unfolded, COVID-19 was limiting the sourcing and processing of raw minerals for batteries as the industry goes towards electrification, messing up supply chains for EV production, and a whole lot more. And this is just basically icing on the cake, further exacerbating the ongoing impacts of the transition towards a clean, sustainable transport future. However, the transport industry is also perfectly positioned to drive this accelerated change and movement as a result of this war, one we need to see, especially as we want to limit fossil fuel-driven power that one country, in this case, Russia, has on the world and towards Ukraine. So transforming the industry towards a more sustainable and battery electric transport future, especially for all things on road, is a massive way to accelerate the clean economy. But is the transport charging infrastructure that we need aggressively scaling enough and correctly to meet the growing demand for EV adoption? And is it doing so equitably, something that is critically important for the industry as we transition? That is what we are going to be looking at today in this session. And I'm joined by some amazing colleagues in the EV space who can touch upon this and much more. So as we chat on all things transport and EV charging, I would like you all to keep in the back of your mind how this all ties back to the ongoing war in the Ukraine, because the faster we can ultimately scale EV charging stations and increase EV adoption globally, the faster we can lessen our reliance on fossil fuels and dependence on countries like Russia that have on the world. So I would like to encourage the speakers also to frame some of their answers from their perspective as well. With that, I see they've all, from my perspective, come on with their cameras. I will run down the list of speakers, and then we will kick it off. Starting with myself, my name is Vartan Badalian. I am the transportation analyst at Greenbiz Group. I am joined by Dr. Shelly Francis, co-founder and managing partner at EV Noir, a chief policy officer at Siemens, Chris King, and then Erika Meyer, executive director, North America at Sharon. Before we dive into some of the questions that I have, and then obviously the audience Q&A at the end, I would like to turn it over to Shelly, Chris, and Erika in that order to introduce themselves quickly and their respective organizations.
So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on which part of the world that you're in. Dr. Shelly Francis, as Vartan shared, I am one of the co-founders and managing partners of EV Noir. EV Noir focuses on two areas of work. It's e-mobility best practice and e-mobility diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so as part of our work, it's really critically important to look at these issues from more of a comprehensive lens. So my background, former medical school professor studying environmental public health disparities, particularly looking at it from the lens of mobility and transportation. And so I look at these issues, and our whole organization is actually looking at these issues from a social determinants of health framework. And so simply this framework explores how where you live, work, and play impacts your health. And one of the greatest predictors of health and well-being is race, as well as zip code. And so this conversation today is really critical in terms of thinking about charging infrastructure, but we also have to understand the broader history in terms of how we got here. So our history has been shaped with disparities and inequities that we see today in terms of where highways are placed, transportation corridors, where they lay, where heavy industry is positioned, and who also has safe access to affordable and reliable mobility options. So we can't talk about transportation, mobility, or technology and policy without acknowledging that all communities have not equally benefited from advancements in both transportation and in the electrification space. So that is the lens that I'm going to be bringing to this conversation today.
I'll go next. So Chris King with Siemens. I'm responsible for our policy activities around e-mobility and some strategic initiatives as well as strategic partnerships. I'm going to bring two perspectives to this conversation, maybe three. I'll start with the first. I have family who were born in Ukraine. So there's an immediate personal connection to all of this for me. Second, so Siemens is a technology company. So we'll be talking about technology and what some of the issues are around bringing that technology to folks. This is a critical time in the energy transition, as well as in geopolitics, right? Because we're talking about electric vehicles, but that ties directly back to renewable energy, and renewable energy is all about obviously decarbonization. And it's also about energy freedom. Nobody, unlike with some of our fossil resources, nobody controls the sun, nobody controls the wind. Every country has access to those resources and can develop them. I was going to say exploit, but they can develop them to support the transition to the new energy economy and to electric vehicles. And then another perspective that I bring, at Siemens brings, we're a big company. We obviously want our business to succeed, but ahead of that, almost, we put our work in trying to open up the markets and to promote the markets for electric vehicle transition and adoption. And that means some things that we get no immediate benefit from working on. Things like open standards, and I know Erika is probably going to say something about that as well. To make EV charging at a public station as easy as buying gasoline at a gas station. Anybody can drive up. Anybody can be confident that there are going to be stations out there. They can be confident that it's working and that they can use it, which is not the case today. We have 23% of stations in a recent survey were not working. And this was in the San Francisco Bay Area. This was not even talking about disadvantaged communities or rural communities. So those equity considerations are very important to us as well, because it comes back to promoting growth of the market, promoting adoption, making this available to people. So I'll bring those perspectives to the conversation today and look forward to it.
And I'll go next. My name is Erika Meyer, and I'm the Executive Director of CHARA North America, and we are a global standards development and support organization based out of Germany. Our goal and mission is one global standard for EV charging, and we have a long way to go to achieve that mission. But again, similar to what Chris mentioned, our hope is that we will be able to make EV charging not only standardized, open, and interoperable, meaning that all vehicles will be able to use the same infrastructure, but that also it will be ubiquitous and easy to access and understand for the average consumer. My background, I've been working in the EV space since 2007, and it's really been fun to see the industry evolve so rapidly, especially in recent years. We've reached a new level of maturity that we haven't reached before, with so many new vehicle models available to consumers, not just for passenger vehicles, but also for now medium and heavy duty fleet owners. And so it's really exciting to see these options proliferate, but we do have a really long way to go to get charging infrastructure to the place that it needs to be in terms of options and pricing and transparency and accessibility, and not just accessibility for the availability of the infrastructure, but also accessibility to all kinds of people. And we have a long way to go in terms of uptime of these chargers, pricing, business models, and things that make charging, cost competitive with gas stations, and also the visibility of these stations. There's really no uniformity of signage, so making sure that people can find the infrastructure, that they know that it exists. And we need to be able to do all these things to reach the next group of EV owners and adopters. Early adopters, we know, are willing to go through a few more headaches here and there to help support the technology, but the average consumer is not. I've talked to a lot of women who have decided to go back from EVs to a hybrid or an internal combustion engine because they found charging access too difficult for them and their families. I've also heard terrible stories about people not knowing how to use the equipment, even when they can find it. There's one Twitter thread about a family who spent 45 minutes figuring out how to use a CCS charger because they had to download an app. They were in a remote area where there was very little signal. And so went through this really long process to finally just get a charge. And, there's all these kinds of stories that come out every single day on social media and through word of mouth. And we're unfortunately hurting ourselves if we're not immediately deploying charging infrastructure that is as good as, if not better than, gas stations. So I'll stop there and looking forward to the conversation.
Amazing. Thank you all. And basically doing the work for me in terms of where we're going to be going here, Erika. So I really appreciate that tee up so nicely. The conversation is going to be broken up into like 4 different buckets now, starting with this idea that there are too many headlines around EV charging uptime and driver dissatisfaction with how they experience an EV charging situation, and that it is not reliable. So I'll be going to you, Shelly, for the first one here. In the US specifically, the Biden administration finally and long awaited released EV charging standards, and they're seeking public comments for them that will basically standardize or create a floor for where the EV charging industry needs to go in terms of fixing uptime, reliability, interoperability, basically creating a minimum standard for how EV charging stations should operate in the United States, something which other countries have explored or also adopted in different ways. And it is clearly needed given what Erika just said and what Chris just also laid out, that there are just too many stories around this. In your view, how important are these standards? Why is it really important right now in 2022, given your work? And what are some of the most pressing things that you've kind of felt out? I know it's been a long document that was released, but some of the things you've heard or read about in the actual standards that are released that you find most interesting. You are muted, Shelly.
Yes. Thank you for that question. So what I was trying to say was that I think these standards are really important, and it's very timely because one, obviously charging infrastructure, EVs, is really on the top of mind across the country for DOTs, for all different thought leaders in this industry. But because the states are at all varying points in the electrification and the e-mobility ecosystem, I think it's even more reason why it's important and critical that we have these minimum standards. So the idea, of course, is that we're going to aim for 500,000 charging stations by 2030. And that could be transformational, given that there hasn't been that investment from the federal government before. Now, done correctly, it could be amazing. It could be extremely transformational, but it's really just a starting point for our country to accelerate our transition to clean energy. So the idea of having these standards or guideposts, it really sets the ground rules for making these stations available and accessible to all drivers, regardless of where you live, where you work, where you play, where you vacation, and regardless of the type of EVs that you have or the charging company. So it's really part of this strategy, I think, is important because we know that, based on historical inequities, that all communities, rural, tribal, and indigenous, they don't all have access to charging infrastructure like, say, many cities do. And even in cities, there are numerous communities that are experiencing charging deserts, so we say, so to speak. So again, the idea of having this guidance is really critical, but at the same time, putting this charging infrastructure in place does one thing. It helps alleviate that kind of public tension or anxiety around range anxiety. And so before we put steel in the ground, or not just putting steel in the ground, is critically important because we have to couple the approach with also education, outreach, and engagement so that people know, like, hey, this charging infrastructure is here. Here's how you access it. Here's how you find it on, your app or the respective apps that it'll be on. So like really doing that work in tandem with putting the infrastructure in is going to be critically important, as well as making sure we're evaluating this process to make sure that we're meeting our objectives and our goals. So making sure that, at certain benchmarks, we're 200,000 stations are up and running. And then by a certain time, another, 350,000 are running. So making sure that this experience really is doing what we have set out, or what the administration has set out to make it do. So, but I will say, kind of to close, is that it's a step in the right direction. It's not the only thing that we need to be doing. Electrifying, obviously, the transportation sector is one of the largest contributors of U.S. greenhouse gases. So we can't just pat ourselves on the back because we have this funding to put charging infrastructure in place. Based on calculations, if we're trying to get to 50% of EVs on the road, we're going to need about 20 times more infrastructure than we currently have. So this is a starting point, but we have to keep going and look at other ways to continue to build out charging infrastructure and or make charging infrastructure more accessible to people at home and at work.
I appreciate that. And that's definitely the framing that I wanted to kind of set. Chris, Erika, do you have any other perspectives to build on what Shelly said, maybe from a global lens? Erika's already raised her hand. Go for it.
I just wanted to echo what Shelly was saying about consumer education. It's something we cannot gloss over. We've all seen the videos of the woman who tried to refill her Tesla at the gas station. That's the kind of stuff we have got to get past in order to encourage broad consumer adoption and awareness of the technology. One anecdote I like to talk about is the time I asked a Tesla dealer representative how many people coming in didn't know that the Teslas were electric. And I was expecting 5-10%. He said closer to a third of the people, even those that have done the research, don't know Teslas are electric. And we have so much work to do on public education. I'm hoping that this investment by the federal government will help with the consumer awareness, especially if we can combine that with really good, highly visible signage. But it's got to be more than that. And, globally, this is not just a trend that's limited to the United States. This is everywhere. The same level of unawareness of the technology, that it even exists, how to get it, how much does it cost, where do I charge this thing? People, have all these misconceptions. There's a terrible amount of misinformation around EVs. I've talked to somebody who was told that if you drive an EV through a car wash, you'll get electrocuted. All these very basic things that we have got to nip in the bud right from the beginning for this industry. And so I'm really encouraged by this investment in the US, and hoping that it will have a trickle-down effect to our neighbors in North America in terms of the similar commitments by governments to make this this initial capital asset investment, but it's got to also be combined with quite a bit of private investment. And so how do we unlock those dollars there as well is a big question.
So Vartan, I want to highlight two of the standards, and hopefully we'll come back to some other ones in there. But the first one being the 97% uptime requirement. I mean, that gets right at the heart, obviously, of the reliability issue that we've been talking about. And that'll be enforced. These chargers will have 5-year maintenance contracts, and they'll have to maintain that 97%, which is going to be a real stretch for the industry. There's no question about that. And the companies are going to have to install new processes, and they're going to have to upgrade their systems to do this. The second one that's in there is a requirement for real-time data, because people need to know when you're driving down the road, where is the charger? Well, that's not real time. You know that from a map. But you need to know if it's occupied. You need to know if it's working. You need to know what the price is. You need to know what the kilowatt rating is and the kind of charger it is. It doesn't do you any good if you're not driving a Tesla to see a Tesla station on your map. So that real-time data API will make it possible. Now, API is a fancy term for just an open data exchange, so that the owner of the stations have to essentially put that online, and then somebody like Google can take it and put it in Google Maps, or Apple can put it in Apple Maps, and then you can see it in real time on your navigation that you're doing on your GPS on your phone. So this is the first time it's done voluntarily by many companies in Europe, but this is the first time it's being proposed as a standard. And that will really help drivers. And then they'll have the confidence when they get there, they can use it. There won't be a line, or it'll be working. So those two standards are ones that really jump out at me, the 97% and the real-time data.
Yeah, I appreciate, first of all, Erika, thank you for your thoughts. And Chris, you laid us perfectly for what I was going to go next to you, which is around the standard a little bit more in depth. And some of the questions and comments that I hear myself, and many others, I'm sure all of you have heard in some way, in one shape or form, which is around this idea of having more stations in the ground in specific locations, aka creating charging hubs or number of stations in the ground, versus ensuring that the 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 stations that are in our location are actually working properly 97% of the time, let's say 99% of the time, reliably. So the question of the debate is, what's more important, having more stations in the ground per location? So should a charger break, then a driver can just go and charge at the next station right next door, or ensuring that we have 4 stations in the ground that are already installed. Let's make sure they're the most reliable as possible. And that may in turn serve the drivers better in the near term than just going in and throwing more funds at deploying more stations in the ground. I would love for you to unpack that thought for me and everyone listening, and what you think is important. And the answer could be both, but I'd love to hear why.
Okay. I'm going to hit on 2 things. First of all, I'm going to answer your question. And the problem with not having standards is that you can have more and more and more. And where do you draw the line, right? I mean, you could say, well, if I have 8 chargers, I'm more likely to have one working than if I have 4. But that's not true if you don't have any standards that apply to those 8 chargers. All 8 of them may be failing. And in fact, one of the big issues that we have in this industry, and it's going to take time to solve this one, is the whole business model problem. Because right now you're getting a lot of public funding, and this will probably continue for installing chargers, but there's not money available to maintain them. And these public chargers are not profitable because the utilization levels are low while the industry is growing. So there's, the financial incentive is get it installed and then go install another one, as opposed to maintain that one and make sure it's still working. So that incentive is being addressed through the federal program and the uptime requirement. So that's important there. Another thing to look at on the standards front, and standards is a, an off-putting word in a lot of ways because it sounds very technical, right? One thing about charging in electric vehicles, thinking about how many things have to talk to each other to make this thing work. Worst case in a gas station, the electricity's got to be on, you got to pump the gas, and there'll be a way to pay somebody who's there with cash or a credit card. But in this system, usually there's nobody present in the first place, right? So there's no person to help you out. But the vehicle actually has to talk to the charger, which is unlike gasoline. There's a communication between the two. The car says, yeah, I'm ready, and the charger turns on and sends power. And then the car says, no, that's too fast. So the charger has to adjust. So that there's communication at that level. And there's a whole map of these things that have to work. Like the driver has to be able to authenticate themselves with some sort of payment methodology between them and the charger. The charger then has to talk to some back office system to process that. If it's not that, if that person is not a member of that charging network, it then has to talk to another network. Again, the gas station example, you read a credit card, it goes to a central processor, Visa, and you're done. So all of these things have to work together. And one reason I point that out is because in this study that was done, where 23% of the chargers were not working, over 90% of the time, the charger, the failure was not the charger. The charger itself would actually charge. But one of these other pieces of the system broke, something wasn't talking to something else, and therefore the payment wasn't processed, or the vehicle couldn't talk to the charger or whatever. So it didn't work. So what's needed there is, again, coming back to the standards, for all of these elements of the system to be able to talk to one another effectively and successfully.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. And I could not agree more, but it's something that I constantly hear often. I think every week I hear that debate between number of stations versus the reliability of said stations. Erika, I would like to pivot to a different angle around the ownership model of EV charging. And then I would welcome comments from Shelly and then also Chris, if you haven't, to build on what Erika said. What is the right way to go about ownership of EV charging infrastructure? And that is a loaded question. So I know that one person can't answer it all, but right now we have a mixed bag of governments owning charging stations in the public. We have private individuals like your motel, your hotel, your local shop owner. And then you have the charging providers as well. So you have three different players owning public infrastructure. And it seems to be that may be one of the root causes of the reliability issue here. I turn it to you.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this off and on for 12 years, and I haven't reached a good conclusion of what's the best business model that's the most sustainable and likely to succeed. If you look at going back to our retailer counterparts, they actually don't really make their money on reselling gasoline. And that's exactly what we're dealing with charging infrastructure, is that it's really difficult to make money on reselling electricity. And so how retailers have done really well is they sell snacks and cigarettes and other drinks and things like that to the people while they're waiting for their fuel or while they're, taking a pit stop. And so we've started to see in Europe kind of this movement towards, can we combine the charging experience with that kind of model where we sell snacks and things. And I think a lot of retailers and convenience store owners are seeing that possibly adding some electricity to like a charger to their stations is another way to go about getting more consumers to use their facilities. And that seems to have some potential draw as well because of access to restrooms and things like that. But I think we really need to kind of take an all of the above solution when it comes to how we distribute funds. We shouldn't just distribute them to one group and say, okay, you guys solve this problem, because we really need, to Shelly's point earlier, we need a lot more infrastructure. We need all the infrastructure we can get right now. And so we really can't just say one winner and all these others, you know, we don't think you'll be able to make it work, because maybe down the road there will be new revenue streams that these particular vendors could take advantage of. And one of the things I've done a lot of research around is grid integration. How could we potentially leverage the battery itself for grid support? And maybe there's some revenue model that we could make work to help that charging infrastructure provider, you know, make more than just what they can in reselling electricity. So it's still, I think, up in the air in terms of how it will all shake out. And I wish I had a crystal ball so I could invest in the right way. I look forward to seeing what Chris and Shelly might have to add on to that.
Yeah, I would say for our sister, thinking about it as the gas station model, when I, as an EV driver, when I'm looking to stop the charge, I'm looking to stop someplace where I have amenities so I can, you know, like Erika, she shared, go out and get a snack, stretch my legs, you know, just walk around. And so having access, you know, thinking about putting the charging infrastructure in a space where you can do that makes a lot of sense. I've seen that. I know, Erika, you and I were both in Norway, you know, last week. And so I saw some of the similar models where it's the gas station model and the charging infrastructure is there, and you can actually, you know, get your snack, you're charging, talking to other EV owners and drivers. So, I mean, I think that's something that's feasible. I think that we shouldn't be looking at limiting charging access at this point. I think as much as we can do to like expand charging access and make it more accessible just really makes a lot more sense to me. So if there are multiple kind of owners of stations, I think the focus should be making sure that the charging is accessible. There's not these memberships, there are not these barriers to accessing charging, like I have to use a credit card or you know, really just making sure that we that the charging infrastructure is inoperable and, you know, it's just easy to use it versus having like, oh, I've got to have like go through like there's 5 different cards that I've got to use to try to figure out which station I have a membership for. So that can be a barrier to the early adopters. It's not, you know, a big deal. We've adjusted to it, but just thinking about new EV owners and drivers, particularly now that gas prices are so high, folks are really, it's really spurring a greater amount of interest. So we really want to make it easy for people to make that transition. Chris, I'd love to know what you think about this.
I like the all the above. And I'll throw out a couple of specific ones. So one, I think rural cooperative utilities are a great, in some cases, maybe even municipal utilities might be great owners and operators of these things. They've got to maintain the electricity anyway. And we set up the whole rural cooperative system because nobody wanted to build electric lines out to these rural areas. So we set up these co-ops. They're nonprofits. They're very good at maintaining and operating these things. And there's some socialization of the costs, which we've kind of agreed as a society makes sense. We want these people in rural areas to have electricity. We understand some of them are getting, you know, it would cost us 10 times to serve customer A compared to customer B, but it's a common good. So that's a good thing. Another one is a little bit more out there. There's actually an organization called Adopt a Charger. We have the Adopt a Highway program. You know, we're cleaning up litter along a section of highway. Why not do the same thing with the charger and, you know, have somebody just voluntarily go out and look at it once a week and see if it's still alive or whatever kind of thing.
I like that. One thing I would just add too is a new business model that I hadn't heard of before, similar to a community-owned solar system. It would be a community-owned EV charging equipment where people would invest in chargers in their neighborhoods and be responsible for owning and maintaining that. So it would be the community that's accessing it the most that would be benefiting from the most, and therefore have the most invested in maintaining it properly. So I think that there could be new business models just like that one that pop up as we expand the number of vehicles on the road and the people that have personal interest in using them.
I love that idea. To anyone who's an entrepreneur listening and wants to start a new business, take what Erika and Chris just said and make it a reality. Sincerely, all EV drivers. I'm going to stick with you, Erika, on this next kind of bucket, which is around universal charging standards. First, you recently joined Charin, so congratulations. Very excited to see you in this new role. Given Charin's focus on interoperability and universal charging standards, I would love, maybe if you can, for everyone listening in, to kind of like level set and quickly define what is and why is it important to have interoperability across EV charging. And then on this broader concept of scaling EV charging infrastructure equity correctly, how does interoperability relate to the equity conversation?
Yeah, so first on interoperability, imagine the frustration of you with your cell phone, right? If you have an Apple versus like a regular Android, not being able, if you went on a trip and you forgot your charger and you went to a country and you said, I need a charger, and the charger didn't exist for your iPhone, can you imagine how frustrating that would be? We're in a similar situation with the EV industry right now, where we have multiple different charging standards used by multiple different automakers. And if you're a consumer, you may or may not know about the differences and nuances between these different charging standards. So you just assume you can go to any charging station and be able to plug in and have no problem, right? Is supposed to all work together. But that's not what's really happening, right? As we hear all the time, people just assume that their new car can use a Tesla charging station. But what they don't realize is that the Tesla charging stations right now in the US are only equipped for Tesla vehicles. So even if you see a Tesla charging station in your neighborhood or community, doesn't necessarily mean you can access that right now because it's using a proprietary standard. What we are advocating for at Charin is the CCS standard, which is the combined charging system is what that stands for. And it's largely used by the US and the European auto manufacturers. And it's definitely been one of the more popular options as far as open standards go. But our friends in Asia are using a different standard called CHAdeMO. And then in China, they're using and developing a new standard called CHAoji. And so what we will have is, an international EV marketplace whereby people are buying these kinds of cars all over the globe and assuming that when they import it to the US, that it will all work the same on all of our systems. And unfortunately, that's just not the case. And so in order for consumers, again, going back to the consumer experience, to really want to make such a large purchasing decision, we really have to think, critically as an industry, how can we find alignment so that ultimately it benefits everybody? And, and same kind of principles go to equity. We want to make sure that it's not just certain consumers that have access to electric vehicles, because we know, as Shelly mentioned, there's huge societal benefits to electrification, especially in transportation, which is a mobile source emission, very difficult to limit the exhaust emissions coming from vehicles. And especially in certain communities that have an over-representation of certain kinds of dirty, polluting vehicles, we want to make sure that these vehicles are everywhere. And so how can we think about not only the interoperability nature of this problem, but also the access nature of this problem? And if we can find alignment within the industry and stop doing proprietary charging investments and doing open and interoperable charging investments, that makes, like, for example, a business case for fleets to go electric a lot easier. If you have to put in your own proprietary equipment, that's a lot of extra cost that you would not necessarily want to spend because the equipment itself is already pretty expensive. for the vehicles. So there's lots of benefits to doing it this way. And it also encourages more cost competition. So we want to get the price of the infrastructure to come down ultimately. So there's just a lot of benefits.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Shelly, I'm going to kind of position you in a way where you maybe go against Erika, that thought process. And please, I apologize for that, but it just seems it's a nice conversation, which is that CCS is the main way that people are deploying chargers in Europe and US, as Erika mentioned. But Tesla, for the longest time, has been locked with just Tesla drivers. And because of this reliability issue, that's partially the reason why Tesla has done that. In addition to, there was no infrastructure to begin with when Tesla was first selling vehicles, so they had to take it into their own hands. But now you have other OEMs also considering what Tesla is doing. In 2022, aka Rivian has announced that they, for some time, have announced that they will be deploying their own fast charging infrastructure for their own drivers. Porsche has announced similarly in Europe that they will be deploying their own DC fast charging infrastructure. What does a world look like where every major OEM has their own fast charging infrastructure in the ground for only their drivers?
Total chaos. And I know you want me to go against the grain of you know, what Erika shared, but it's hard for me to really do that because I just feel like every automaker building out their own charging infrastructure is just so highly inefficient and is not a good use of limited resources, in my opinion. So I feel like it would be a better strategy to maybe invest some of those resources into wireless charging and battery swap technology and building the charging infrastructure into the roadway so that as people are driving on the road, they're recharging their vehicles. And, you know, some of that technology obviously is currently available, like the battery swap technology. NEO is doing that. And that's like really an amazing technology that I have it on my LinkedIn if people want to go look at it. But I mean, that battery swap takes literally like 2 to 3 minutes to do it. So that's another way to address some charging infrastructure. I think being creative and not just limiting ourselves to the actual physical charging infrastructure where you're getting out of your vehicle and putting it in your car. Erika raised this, like there are women that are leaving EVs because difficulty charging, but they're also leaving for safety reasons because you're sitting in your car. It's kind of almost like being a sitting duck. If you're in an area where there isn't much around, you're in the car by yourself. It could be, you know, dusk or night. And, you know, you're thinking about like somebody comes up, like what's going to happen? I can't eject the charger from the car yet. So just thinking about some of those other ways to charge, I think is a potential strategy. It's very different from probably with the initial question that you posed to me, Vartan, but I think it's just another way to think about charging. It doesn't have to be the grab and plug it in your car method. It could be some other strategies that are, you know, being piloted and have been doing really well. So how's that?
That was good. That was good for me. I mean, I just wanted to set the table and see where you took it. But I think anyone in the industry could agree with you and both Erika on that. Given time, I'm going to quickly go with my next question to Chris because I really want to hear his thoughts on this. So, Chris, Siemens recently invested in wireless EV charging. So I'm really curious to hear what you believe and think is needed from like an all hands on deck approach, kind of what Shelly was just mentioning in terms of battery swapping also being a solution. Like, why did Siemens invest in that in wireless charging? And what does it say about the story for EV charging and, or quote unquote refueling of EVs moving forward?
We see it as a huge part of the future. The value proposition is pretty simple, right? You don't have to get out of the car and plug in a cable to charge your vehicle. You drive home at night, you just pull in the garage, it starts charging. You pull into a parking place at a mall, it just charges. You don't have to do anything. Now to get there, you have the same issue that we've been talking about, which is standards and interoperability. And why isn't it happening today? Well, we have to get all of the OEMs to agree that they're going to implement the same technology in the same way. And we're a long ways from that. There is a standard, an SAE standard that's out there, but it's not finalized. One of the things that we hope to do with our investment and partnership with Witricity is to bring that to a final standard that everybody can agree on. And so then you can have this, because it doesn't do you a lot of good if the only place that works is at home, because every time you go out, you're still going to have to plug in. Now, we do think certainly for several years of transition, you're going to have both on your vehicle. And the downside of that is it adds costs. So that's the biggest challenge, probably. Those are the two biggest challenges. One is to get that standard in place, and one is to get the cost down of doing this, which also comes back to the standard. Like Erika said, when you have a standard, multiple companies make the equipment, they compete against each other, and they drive the cost down. But we're really supportive for the value proposition for the EV driver, but it's also very important, and even more important when you get to autonomous vehicles. So you have your autonomous taxi running around, comes home, parks, charges automatically, doesn't have to interact with a person to do that. So those are the two primary use cases that we see for it, and we see a bright future for it. It's a few years out, several years before it's really widely adopted, but it won't be the only solution. It'll be one of a couple of solutions out there.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think one of the many reasons why I love working in the EV industry is that it's so futuristic and forward-looking. It's like taking child's dreams and making it into a reality when you think about how a vehicle should operate or how a city should look. And I think it's super cool, and wireless charging fits directly into that imagination that I think many of us had. I think hopefully after we have flying cars that are electric, that'd be super cool to see. But until that moment, I think vehicle to grid, wireless charging will be pretty cool as we start implementing that into society. Shelly, I have a question for you around equity, and this is your bread and butter at EV Noir. Is there an example in the United States or globally that you've seen equity be really truly thought about when the EV industry is being considered in terms of deploying chargers, EV adoption, what have you? Is there an example that comes to your mind of like a really good leadership moment?
Yes. So without going and naming the specific city, I'll tell you like some of the steps that they took to make sure that equity was truly like integrated into their approach. And so one of the cities that will not be named, the city, they were very intentional when they were crafting their city's decarbonization strategy to think about all the different players or key stakeholders that are impacted by mobility and transportation. And so, they brought a conglomeration of folks from the public sector, the private sector, community activists, residents, folks from all walks of life who might not normally be part of that e-mobility conversation to really kind of level set and think about what was needed in terms of addressing mobility for all different residents, as well as thinking about mobility, the fleet electrification, charging infrastructure, education and outreach. And so they were very intentional in looking at baseline data, so getting perspective from all those different key stakeholders, looking at which communities were overexposed, over impacted by transportation emissions. Where were those heavy transportation routes? Where could the electric buses that they were purchasing be deployed? Hey, deploy them in those communities that are overexposed and have really high rates of air pollution from transportation emissions. So they were very intentional in terms of like really socializing the strategy, having feedback and like keeping that feedback loop going with community stakeholders and key stakeholders, and not just like, hey, we're having this, town hall. We want feedback from you, and then we're never going to hear from you again, or we're never going to ask you for feedback or give you updates on how we utilized your feedback. So there's a really a mutually agreeable feedback loop, or there's like a two-way feedback loop, so that the community other key stakeholders are really helping to refine the strategy as it goes. Because the strategy, just because they completed it on June 1st, let's say, and it's approved, it's not that doesn't mean that it's finalized. It's going to be adjusted based on the needs of the different key stakeholders. So just really being intentional in utilizing data to inform the policy and the programs, and like really talking to real people who are impacted by those decisions and impacted by transportation emissions really is a way to make sure that you're integrating equity and you're evaluating it and making sure that this is like a sustainable process, and it's not just like oops, we checked the box on equity and now we're done, thank you. So that was some of the key steps that they utilized. They utilized an equity framework. We worked with them through that process. And so, just making sure that that process is grounded in utilizing best practice really makes a difference in like hearing from those who are impacted by transportation emissions, as well as the mobility policies that are going to be put in place.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Seems like data is always important, even looking at equity. So any government, please consider real-time data when addressing equity concerns and EV charging. We have an audience question. I have my final question that I wanted to ask, but I think this one is really good to touch on. And if we still have time in the last 5 minutes, I'll go to my final question. And it's for anyone in the trenches, as this question kind of notes, who was trying to really move forward the industry. How can we, the industry, combat the fear that even mainstream media is kind of brewing and picking up around the human rights issues and abuses that are occurring for battery minerals, even when they don't mention the other side, which is that the battery recycling industry is growing quite substantially. So that is for all of you.
I'll just kind of throw a few thoughts out here, is that I think people aren't aware of how valuable these batteries actually are to a lot of other industries. And so we hear lots of reports of used EVs going to recyclers and, like car crushing companies, and the batteries get taken out and sold because they're so valuable to other industries, hobbyists, boaters, things like that. So none of these batteries are going into landfills. I can pretty clearly state that at this point in most places. And that there's also this very robust group that's focused around green manufacturing for batteries and also sustainable material usage for batteries called the Global Battery Alliance, GBA. I would highly recommend people who are concerned to check that out, because it is all the major manufacturers are pretty much members of this, and there is a huge amount of work being put into making sure that the materials are being ethically and sustainably sourced and used, and all the way through to the end recycling phases.
Yeah,
so this isn't directly on that point, but it's, I think, very closely related. So one of the things we haven't talked about on the equity side is the workforce. And this transition is creating huge opportunities for installing, maintaining, operating, manufacturing all of this equipment on the EV charging side, as well as the vehicles themselves. Siemens has a program, we have a partnership program where we partner with women and minority-owned businesses and provide training so that they can be our partners and do the installation of chargers. We also partner with a couple of community colleges to provide training as well. So this is definitely, a bright spot that we want to highlight a little bit more in the industry, and something that's very important.
Yeah, and I will chime in and say that for us, the workforce and economic development opportunity is really critically important. So on our nonprofit side, we've created a couple of different programs to create a pipeline for professionals to work in that space, whether it's retooling their existing skill set or exposing, the younger generation, like high school, K through 12 college students to and young people who are not in college to opportunities in this space, because we're going to need folks who are not just engineers. We're going to need folks who can do everything. So there's opportunities for folks with high school degrees all the way up to obviously doctoral degrees. And just to add on to what Erika mentioned about the battery, as we technology improves, we're looking at ways to just really, create more, create battery technology that is not going to be a burden on communities. It's going to be sustainably sourced. And so, as the battery technology improves, battery cost decreases, I think we're on the right path to creating an ecosystem where, the battery has multiple lives. It may have a 10-year warranty, but we're going to use it for another 10 years doing these other things, because there's still a lot of life left in the battery or the different components. So I think that is definitely top of mind for folks who are in this space, as Erika shared, and people are really looking closely at how to make sure that we are sustainably sourcing materials and looking at, utilizing technology to minimize the use of those critical minerals where possible.
Well, we're at the hour. That couldn't have been a more perfectly timed 1 hour session. Thank you so much, Shelly. Thank you so much, Erika. And thank you so much, Chris. It's always great to see all of you. I'm going to turn it back to our wonderful hosts, and a final pitch to everyone listening. Please do continue putting support towards helping individuals in Ukraine. Thank you so much.